Hey guys, welcome back to Star Wars Timeline. I'm so pleased to introduce our new podcast series, where Mike and I are basically going to go over our favorite Star Wars modern and Star Wars classic comic books. Mike, how are you doing? I think you and I are going to have a lot to say about this series. So what are we talking about today? We're discussing the Dark Horse, The Dawn of the Jedi series, part 1. We're covering the first 5 books, which takes place 36,000 years before the events of the movies. And Mike, we'll just basically jump right into the story. And as we go along, you and I will basically break down the storyline, share our thoughts, and discuss what this comic book is all about. But can you give us just in a nutshell, what can we anticipate in terms of Michael's reaction to this book?
I'd never read Dawn of the Jedi before. I'd loosely heard of it. I read the novel, which people can see behind me, Into the Void, which no, Ben hasn't read, which I enjoyed. I read that several months ago. But with this, I think it's interesting. It's very new. It's very different. And it leans much heavier on the fantasy and less so on the sci-fi element, because obviously Star Wars kind of emerge. But I will say that I think that the first 5 issues of these, because basically 15, isn't there? The first 5 issues, I would probably say are the weakest.
Okay. Well, I think will be very interesting taking a look at different specific points, because Mike and I, as we are pretty close friends, we have vastly different opinions on everything Star Wars. Anyway, guys, are you ready? Let's dive right into it. I'm very interested to pick your brain to see what you liked, what you disliked, and how the story overall worked for you. So, the Force Storm. The actual story begins 26,000 years ago, describing the events 10 millennia before, where Master Keto narrates the story of the origins of the Jedi. And what happened in that 10 millennia ago is we see on the planet Andor Prime, the Dai-Bendu monks are calling, and they enter into your pyramids, right? They hear a call, they enter them, and there's some kind of connection to their ancient prophecies of this new machine that arrives. So your Thor harvests people not just from their homeworld, from several other planets such as Kashyyyk, Dathomir, Ryloth, Manaan, and they bring all of these passengers to Tython. And they seem to be all connected by this mystical energy, right? This primal energy, which we don't quite yet call the Force, but we obviously as readers all know what it's all about. And the settlers of this world begin to call themselves the Tythons. And they dedicate themselves to the study of the Force and try to master its abilities. Now, we also observe the 2 moons, Ashla and Bogan, representing the light and the dark. And as the story is being narrated of the ancient past to us, we also hear of this second migration. Because those individuals who were brought over but not attuned to the Force, they found their lives to be miserable on this planet, and they had to leave. And eventually, all of the Force sensitive, the early precursors to the Jedi, they begin to settle the nearby planets, the entire Tython system. And they become this, the stuff of legend, these mythological Jedi, right? And we also hear of the first conflict, the Despot War, where this despot queen, Hadiya, she subjugates the settled worlds, and she resists the Jedi rule. She doesn't accept their authority, and she says, we will defeat the Jedi at no matter what the cost is. And obviously she pays the ultimate price with her life, and it creates this rift between the original early Jedi and their children. So the first question I want to throw is, let's talk about John Ostrander's writing style. John Buscema's pencil work and Wes Zoba's colors. Overall, what did you think of this package, the first 5 issues?
So visually, I think the artwork's amazing. Really, really enjoyed the artwork. No problems at all with any of the art style or anything like that. The writing, it's a hard one because I basically had to reread almost every issue a couple of times. Like I read it once and I was like, I need to, especially this first issue, I had to read it about 3 times to really get a grip, because it's so heavy in lore and it's so new that it took a little while to kind of get to grips with. And I think that this first issue, as opposed to the other ones, is also quite the first half of this issue isn't even really necessarily a story per se. It's really just a dump of exposition and lore. Like, here's like 8 or so pages of just really condensed history of what all this happened. But once you get past that, I did enjoy it. I did. There's the odd moment in the writing where I had to go back and reread stuff because something is like quite heavily insinuated, I found. And then you're like, oh, I guess that's how it was. And then it moves on. And I feel like it wasn't quite rushed, but it felt quite quick. So I do like it as a package. I think they did a stellar job of the amount of effort, and you could kind of feel throughout this is like a passion project, I think, for the two of them, the 15 issues. So I did enjoy it. I thought it was good. It's just that I think maybe because it's so new, for me, it was quite a lot to take in, and I did have to reread certain elements quite a bit. What about yourself?
Gotcha. I relish in everything of this archaism in storytelling. When we go to the ancient past, when we discover how things used to be and how the world or conscience has evolved over millennia or so, and not just necessarily Star Wars in general. So what you alluded to earlier on, that huge exposition in the beginning, there's also an issue 0, which is basically connects very well with part 1 of the comic book, where it's basically an origin myth. They're telling you where this stuff came out, and you can't quite deduce what of it was factual stuff that actually historically happened, and what of it is just the oral traditions being passed down from generation to generation, telling you of these early lore of these great Jedi. I relish in this stuff. I think one of the recurring themes that I'm going to repeat in this discussion is the density and volume of work that is being put in, which is very uncanny by comic book standards. Mm-hmm. And I personally love that. For me, my style is story first, action second. As a fan, obviously, we love all the cool stuff in the Star Wars, but for me, story comes first. And
may I just add with issue 0? I did also read issue 0, and I'd say anyone who's listening to this, anyone. I read that first, and I was like, this isn't a normal comic. This is almost an encyclopedia. It felt like a visual dictionary almost in a great way. And I'd say anyone who's delving into Dawn of the Jedi, if you're delving into the comics first, get issue 0, because I referred back to that numerous times. I found it so helpful, especially for character names, because as we unfold, there's lots of characters who share lineage, or similar in this way, or similar in that way, or they're connected, but you don't know how. And it's like issue 0 really helped me in these first few issues kind of align myself if there were parts missing. So I'd say, issue 0 is great.
Well, folks, that's the sound advice. And I think you can approach it twofold. What Mike is pointing out, I think it's completely helpful, especially to beginner fans who may get simply lost in the story and completely abandon it. It's a great helper tool. But from the other side, if you're the type of person who loves to jump in the thick of a story and then sort of try to figure out a part, then you could start off maybe with issue 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and then say, well, hold on a second, I'm more curious about what's the connection here, and still refer to issue 0 and have a fun way with it. Now, as we resolve the myth and it translates now into real time, we see the first lesson that Master Keru teaches his pupils is that anger is not necessarily bad. What he does is warn both young pupils against excess of any kind. And he speaks of maintaining that balance. And, that there's light in darkness and darkness in light. And that you shouldn't be a slave to either one. And you should always pay heed and observe the distinction between Ashla and Bogan, right? The two moons surrounding Tython. Quite different from the Jedi dramatic views we see in the prequel era, especially when we get a lot of Jedi philosophy and tradition and thought. What do you make of it? Which one would you agree with more?
It is tough. I think I agree more with this idea of the Jedi, the old school Jedi teaching. I don't like the fact, I know it wasn't established in this, it was established prior to these coming out, but I wish they weren't called the Jedi. I wish it was an amalgamation of the name Jedi and Sith, even if it was just Sith or something like that. Right. I'd be more, because these, even their whole, the thing they say, like the, I can't remember what the term is, but it's like their code. When you read it, it's the Sith code and the Jedi code smushed together, obviously, because it's beforehand, technically speaking, it's the Jedi Sith code ripped apart. But I think the balance idea is really good, and I like the themes of this, and it does mean that the characters and the Force abilities are more fresh, because I really like morally grey characters. I've said on your show before, Starkiller from the Force Unleashed games, I really, really connect with. That's one of my favorite pieces of Star Wars content in existence because I like humans. None of us are always good and happy and only showing positive emotion, but very few of us are also only negative. And I think you really need to balance both. You know, there are times where being angry can be good because it gets frustration out. There's times where being sad is good because it lets you reflect on things. But obviously, you want to be happy. But if you're happy all the time, you can't be a normal, balanced human being. So I really, really like that. And I think it does really lend itself to showing some of the follies of the Jedi, especially because obviously when this came out, it's right at the tail end of Legends. This is post prequels. And I think one of the things that was alluded to in the prequels that wasn't conveyed very well until the Clone Wars came out, the series, is that the prequel Jedi failed to align to their own code in a sense. They lost their own way. And I think that this actually works really well to show kind of what it should have been and how over the generations and millennia, it's really kind of become twisted, I think, in the wrong ways for both the Jedi and the Sith, I think.
Yeah. On my end, I would say that it's the lore and the ideas that the master presents to his students is deceptively inclusive. Because we have this grand idea that, you know, the greater balance, you know, follow the straight and narrow path in between. It will begin to unravel as we read on, as we get through the first 5 parts. And later on, it's like, yeah, it's all nice and neat on the blueprint, on the paper. But as we get to the reality of things and human emotions sway and our allegiances crystallize through conflict, then it doesn't quite work. And neither it did clearly for the prequel era Jedi because they fell. Maybe it is that balance that needs to be found between the archaism, the ancient Jedi with their earlier ideas, because they're still exploring, they're still figuring out what it means in their lives, compared to battle-hardened prequel era Jedi who had no other option but to throw themselves into this military conflict, and lo and behold, they were destroyed through the means of this evil snake, the Sith, who destroyed them.
Yeah, and I think to your point as well, again, with this gentleman, when he's speaking and he's saying all this balance, as you say, as you go further on, there's really a lot of crack showing, which again, a lot of the similar cracks that the prequel era Jedi do, and a lot of repression and a lot of not listening to people.
And that's the beauty of the story, because we are dealing with a fictional world that is yet so relatable to ours, where there's a failure to reason and to understand and empathize with someone who is different than you are. Moving on, we are on Tatooine, the ancient Tatooine, where the infinite Rakata Empire subjugates the native Gumumga, and enter Predor Tolkar, which is like a military office, I guess, his station, and his force hound Zesh. And there's a calling of the force-sensitive natives of Tatooine. And we see some inner politicking and bickering going on between the Rakata military, file and rank, and Oramun covets Tulkar's position. So there's a lot of envy going on as well. Now, the Infinite Rakata Empire are a huge part of Star Wars lore. How familiar were you with it when you started reading the comic?
Almost none. I know they are central to I think it's the Old Republic and Knights of the Old Republic games. And I've played very fleeting moments of those games when I was much younger. I think I've probably watched you play it more than I've actually played it, to be honest with you. So I knew very little. I saw the species and I was like, I recognize the name. So I had to do the standard going on Wikipedia and then checking through things like that just to check that and see where they appeared and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of went into this fairly blind, aside from, again, reading Dawn of the Jedi Into the Void. Yeah. I knew very little about this. To me, it literally is a legend because the information I recall from a lot of the really old legend stuff is very, very slim. But I know you were quite a big fan of those games, weren't you?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of both games. I just started my replay of the second title, which actually my first video is dropping today. But yeah, as a huge fan of the Rakata Infinite Empire, I'm very, very curious and excited to hear you. Kind of like you went into it with virgin eyes, right? There, like you said, there are unknown elements to you. So it'll be very interesting to see how 2 generations of fans and coming at it from a different angle will be able to look at them. But what kind of first impression did that particular scene left in you?
I mean, it's a pretty powerful scene. I know that the comics can get away with doing quite mature things. I know Star Wars has always had elements of maturity in it, but I think that, yeah, that scene where the kid basically gets executed and then the dad does, and then everything just gets set on fire, it very eloquently shows just the pure ruthlessness of the
Mhm.
Rakata. But I will say that I think in Star Wars they do it a lot because it's the whole good versus evil thing, but I don't really like villains that have absolutely zero depth. I
Mhm.
don't like it where it's just, I'm evil and I have power and that's my whole personality. Anyone
Mhm.
who tries to take that bit from me, I'll kill them. And I'm like, we've seen this so many times in and out of Star Wars, and I just find it a bit bland because, not to necessarily try and spoil things, but you know they can never ever win. When you're that evil, you,
Right.
you cannot ever win, because if you did, it's the destruction of the entire universe. Whereas when you get someone there's another character in this who's a lot more interesting, when you get to someone who is a bit more morally grey and you don't know what their intentions are and their intentions change, I really like those characters because they are unpredictable. And I just found when I saw this, I was like, yeah, I can see they're kind of a threat, I guess, but
Mhm.
I'm not. I'm not overly. I wasn't overly convinced, I should say, in this first issue at least.
Mhm. Yeah. And we end actually on quite a foreboding note, wrapping up the issue number one, right? We are on the planet of Bis, and the military temple fortress where Praetor's Skalnas summons Tulkar. And his own Force Hound Trill's discovery that there's a Force-rich world deep within the core. Aha, that's our next, point of conquest. And the two hounds of the two military rank and file guys, they start combating each other without formal challenge. But Predator Tolkar claims the right of conquest. He said, nope, stop. If we're going to do it, it's going to be done according to our law. Very much like we see with Klingons in Star Trek or something. Very well developed and fleshed out social boundaries established. And the Force Hound Zesh promises that he will indeed deliver the armies to the Force-rich world. I mean, what a cliffhanger. What is your anticipation for issue 2 after you end up there?
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested. I'll say just by like Trill as a character, I really enjoy. I like Trill, and as her journey develops throughout these issues, I
Mm-hmm.
really enjoy her and the interaction with Zesh. I mean, the problem is that, and again, this goes to your point of the problem is of reading issue zero. Is reading issue zero, I find, kind of does, I wouldn't say necessarily spoil, but it tries not to, but it can't help itself by kind of revealing what's going to happen in the first couple of issues of this first sort of arc. So I kind of knew loosely what was going to happen, or at
Mm-hmm.
least I thought I did. But I'd say when I finished this issue one, I was like, okay, I'm not actually bought in yet. But as we get there, I think issue two is much, much stronger. I think this issue for me almost felt a little bit like issue zero. And then issue two for me felt like this big, you know, big epic kind of
Mm-hmm.
feel to it. Like with you, when you read these, did you read these as they were coming out, or did you
Yes.
read them? Okay, so you
Because
you
this
had to
was
wait then.
an example of where I started reading comic books as they were coming out. I managed a comic book store for 13 plus years. I wasn't checking out Star Wars comic books at that time because my journey started with novels, and I just felt a little bit overwhelmed. There's inundation of so much Star Wars material going on. I said, you know what, let me pace myself, I'll read those later. But those I decided to check out because they're in my time now when I'm working, managing a comic store. Let me start picking them up. And the first issue, I mean, I just saw Yandu Shermer's artwork. It just blew my face off. I'm like, oh my God, where's issue 2? What's going to happen? Speaking of, issue number 2. He said much stronger. Okay, so thoughts there. So we are seeing issue 2 opens up. We have the Twilight Jedi Ranger Hawk Rio, or Hawk Rio, right? He's on board of a Furious Gate outpost station, and he informs Typhon of incoming ships. He senses darkness at the same time. At Adalkesh, a temple of alchemy, Master Kwanjang and Shaikota attempt to calm Butch. And Butch is a flying rancor dragon, which is clearly, right, it doesn't happen in nature. It's a genetic experiment. And we also know that in this setting, below the temple, there's some force interference. And any force sensitive that go into it end up dead. It's a forbidden no man's land. And the master obviously warns his pupil, and he reckons that Tython is out of balance and that a storm is brewing. So we have two separate scenes. Talk about the synergy of writing here, attention to detail and the world building as we're getting the story from two different focal points.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sets it up nicely for how these issues go, because one of the things I did initially struggle with was a little bit of that back and forth. And I know that's very common in Star Wars and even a lot of comics. Like you read almost any of the mainline Star Wars comics, it's always got kind of mainly a main story and then a B story, and then normally the B story kind of intertwines. But this is very Game of Thronesy, where every storyline is more or less as equal and as important as the rest. And I found that it was interesting because like the planet sensing thing out, like the planet being out of balance, I was like, is this metaphorically speaking? Is this literally? And then when you see it, you go, oh, this with the lightning, it's a prophetic fallacy. It's when you see lightning occurring and rain and stuff in films, it's normally, oh, sadness or badness. So when you see it here, I think it works really, really well, the two parts. But I will say that once I saw the Rancor Dragon, I mean, I saw it on the cover of this issue anyway. But once I saw that, I was like, that's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. Maybe I don't get out much, but I was just like, a flying Rancor. I was like, has that actually, I know it's a slight tangent, but has that been in anything else before?
I believe not. I think this was the first time.
That's what I was going to say, because I was thinking, I was like, if it's in Knights of the Old Republic or something, but I was like, it's such a simple idea, but so cool, and it's like its own one unique thing. They genetically, created it, but I think that it works really well. Of the reason I like this issue so much more is within 4 pages, I'm more bought in than I was for the entirety of the last one.
Yes,
and I think because the last one was lore dump, sprinkling of characters, bad side, and I was like, the stakes of what the bad side or the Rakata Infinite Empire, what they're trying to get, I have no idea what the weight is, because I have no connection to whatever it is they're seemingly going to conquest. Mm-hmm. So for me, I was like, I don't know or care where these people are going, because the place they're going, I haven't seen enough. But immediately seeing this, I was like, oh, the intrigue and the fantasy elements really come into it very, very strongly. And I liked them talking about like the dark energy, and they haven't felt this way since, for a little while, and I think that's kind of loosely linking in with the Despot Wars and stuff. And so I really, really enjoy that element and the synergy between them. I mean, I do much prefer the stuff of Shea Coda and the Rancor Dragon. I love all of that stuff. What about yourself?
Yeah, so for me, the question, the way I wrote it, I wanted to focus on these parallel threads of a story being given to us. And I really, really enjoy it because it helps begin to layer the world and show you that there's all these things and moving elements happening all at the same time. And it could be a great boon to the story, or it could be a great curse, depending on how much of a talented the storyteller is tying it all up together. Because you can't diverge my mind in 5 different directions and not make it very coherent and memorable. That, okay, if this is happening here, then I have to go to this station over there, and then now we're back on Tython, but the Rakata generals are on this planet. It needs to coalesce together into something that you can follow as a reader. And I think it does it very effectively. And it immediately stood out to me because unlike most comic books, which to this day have adapted that classic golden age era sort of aesthetic where it's basically what you see is what you get. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. Simple storytelling works. It's effective. It's memorable. It strikes you. But I really enjoyed this approach because it made Star Wars feel grand. Not through its visuals, not through throwing 1,000 ships in a single screen for you. Thinking of the Rise of the Skywalker scenes in the battlefield, which did nothing for me. Here, this is where the epic scope comes from, of setting this whole thing up. But story aside, because that's always interesting to discuss, you mentioned something that I want to push on. You said the flying Rancor is just a cool looking thing. Oh my God, that's amazing. I want to continue that thought and ask you the next question is, I mean, we saw Force Hounds, we saw Jedi Masters, we saw the Journeyman students. And I want you to comment on Yandur Shema's character design specifically.
I really like them because every character feels very unique. very unique. Again, Dawn of the Jedi Zero helped that because you get like a paragraph of bio information for each one of them. But I read all of issue 0, forgot it immediately, delved into issue 1 to sort of 5, and then I finished issue 5, as in the finale of the arc of the Force Storm, and then I went back to issue 0 again, and I was like, oh, okay, now the dots are connecting. But yeah, I really like the characters because visually they look very different. There's different species, there's different like hairstyles, outfits, that element. So visually, immediately you can see the difference, while also the way, especially in this issue, again, this is why I prefer this issue a lot more to the prior one. It shows the layers a lot more. It's like this really condensed thing in like issue 1, and then I feel like in issue 2 it really pulls it apart, and you can really identify each
That's
of the things.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And I find that, yeah, in this, like immediately, like you see Hawk and what he's kind of doing and what his priorities are. And then you immediately change when you see Shay and you see her interacting with the Master. The difference is just in the first page, you see them both interacting. The way they approach the Force is so different. And I think as it unfolds and you get because there's sort of 4-ish main characters. It's mainly 3, but the 4th kind of almost changes per issue who the main other sort of co-star is. But I really enjoyed it. I think the characters for me, you said that story is your number one thing. And I think for me, story is the number one thing for most stuff I consume. It does sort of depend. But for me, it's characters, not action scenes. I mean, if I'm watching, an action movie, whatever. But like for the most part, for me, characters are the thing that really keep me going. They're the things that why I'm probably quite forgiving on certain pieces of Star Wars content because, and this is, almost a trap, which is there's a character you like in it, not really doing anything, but you're just happy to see the character. So yeah. I'm a sucker for a character I really connect with. And I genuinely found that there wasn't really a character I found in this apart from the Rakata species themselves. Aside from them, I thought every character had so much intrigue to them. I could probably read a one-shot or maybe an own little mini-series about almost any of these characters. I would be more than happy, or even if there's like a book that kind of was like a short story collection, and you got a bit more of what these characters were doing before this, or what certain characters did after all these events. Mm-hmm. I think for me personally, the best thing about all of these Dawn of the Jedi, all the Jedi content, including the book, which is connected, but it is its kind of own story. The characters for me are really the thing that made me enjoy this and stood out beyond anything else, to be honest with you, personally. What about yourself in that regard?
And I wanted to add that it felt from first pages that a lot of forethought went into designing these characters visually, because their costumes feel like there is a story behind them, and they're not just accessorized for the sake of it or just for cheap sex appeal. Like the ladies look absolutely stunning, right, in this comic book, and the males are very heroic, right? Even the Sith journeyman, the apprentice, he's a attractive looking guy, right? And the women even comment on it. We'll get to that particular part. But nothing is trivialized. Nothing is done as eye candy. And everything is so deliberate and thought out that you believe in these characters.
And they feel real. They feel very real, I'd say.
They feel real.
Also, from the start to the end of all of these issues, it feels, and this is my biggest issue with a lot of modern Star Wars and it's overtly clear with the sequels, which is they didn't have a plan. For all the prequels, I know I'm a big prequel apologist, but for all of the flaws of the prequels, he had a plan. You watch Phantom Menace and the stuff that pays off in Revenge of the Sith. Right. The dialogue across the 3 films definitely needed some work, but the plan was there. In the original trilogy, even though there wasn't one from Star Wars, with Empire and Return of the Jedi, there was a plan. And with these comics, I find that it really works. You can feel the entire time there is never a misstep. There's never a bit you read and you go, wait, what? In a sense of this doesn't fit. There were bits where I was like, I don't understand what's happening because there's so much. But by the end, everything really succinctly fits together.
Shai Kora, she struggles to control her mouth. And at the same time, she sees a vision of this shadowy, dark figure. Obviously, we know who this is, but she doesn't. And the master saves his student and Butch, and Shai leaves in search of her vision. She says, I must do this, master, right? What function do the visions serve in comics versus movies, you think?
See, I'm a big sucker for Force visions, especially in comics. I must confess, I haven't read that many Legends comics, but with this series, we'll be doing more. But in the canon comics, at least, I would say almost all of my favorite issues of Star Wars comics are Vision related. A lot, especially a lot of the Darth Vader stuff. But in the films, they really don't do many. There's the Luke Skywalker Dark Side Cave in Empire Strikes Back, which it took me years to figure out what that meant because I watched it when I was like really young. So, and then there's a bit from Rey in like The Force Awakens, and then you get a little bit of like foresight from Anakin in Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, but they don't use visions very much. They talk about it an awful lot, but it's not really in it, which is quite upsetting because I love the mystical, weird stuff that's kind of down to interpretation. I love the lessons trying to be taught in a lot of these Star Wars movies, which is you get a vision, it's not that clear. The Clone Wars does it a lot better, I think, the certain visions, especially there's like the Yoda arc, which is very much mystical forcey. But I think that the way they do it in this, especially because from seeing, as we know, it's Zesh, when you get to see the other characters also experience something similar, I think, and then when you get to understand how that happened, which is much later in these runs, I think that it works together so well as a storytelling device without feeling cheap. I think that this is the kind of thing which is like, it all links together, it all makes sense, and also it organically makes the plot move forward, as opposed to something coming out of nowhere and being like, suddenly everyone was at the same point. And you're like, how? This actually, every new piece of information you learn about visions in this series, all is very well thought out. It not only serves the plot, but it also in universe actually makes sense. And that's what I like the most about it, because visions in and outside of Star Wars, sometimes you're like, this came out of nowhere. This character's never had a vision before, and they never have since. So they had it once in this one instance just to move the plot along for no reason. Rey in The Force Awakens. And I love that film, don't get me wrong. And I like Rey as a character. But she touches the lightsaber, gets this crazy vision. You go, oh, she's got psychometry like Quinlan Voss. And they're like, let's never talk about that ever again. And you go, what? That's the feeling of that doesn't make sense and has been left unexplained. It's very different to here's a cryptic clue that makes sense. That's the kind of differences I'd say. Do you feel similarly?
So I made this distinction as I was thinking on this, is that obviously film is a moving picture and it's accompanied by acting, voice, music. So there's a lot of elements, and you may use a vision as a device to evoke a feeling, give you sort of a premonition. It's very, very intuitive, rather rational, like Luke's experience in the Cave on Dagobah, like Rey's experience on Acto. I don't think they're necessarily meant to progress the plot forward. They're not used as a story building block, whereas in the comic books, it is. Because chances are, if you notice, if you see a vision in a comic book, some form or version of that will come to fruition.
That's a good point.
Or the reverse. It will always be utilized. So what they're doing in this particular book is they're showing you how the Force, because look, the art of comic book is economy. You have your pictures and you have your limited text bubbles to convey a story. And hopefully, if they're very talented, it will be just as engrossing and rewarding as reading a book or watching a movie, right? And what the artists and the writers are doing in this book, they're showing you how destiny connects all of these individuals via this vision.
It's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. And I think you are right. In comics, as you say, because they have to be, you can't really waste space in a comic. I think that's every bit you put in there, especially because the artist is on deadlines and there's a certain amount they have to do. It's like they can't necessarily always spend time wasting space.
Yeah, it needs to be long.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I would push back a smidge and go that one of the comics that we'll delve into in the series, from my perspective, the 2017 run of Darth Vader comics by Charles Soule, that I think does visions in quite a different way. But the reason I love those comics so much is because nowhere else has replicated it, and it's really frustrating because everyone's like, here's some of the gold standard of canon comics. Let's just not do them like this again.
Yeah.
What's that? I want more vision stuff. But yeah, sorry, that's a tangent.
Yeah. Moving on through this issue, on Shikawa Frontier World at the Rio Fortress, a Kalak assassin, Jaris Khan, very much looking like a space samurai, he breaks in to assassinate its Baron, Valnus. Inside, the Twi'lek leader is talking to his estranged daughter, Tasha, and says, look, you are my heir. I love you. Take your rightful place as a clan leader. I need you here. But she says that, look, my loyalties are to the Jedi. I've committed my life to them. And, we hear our father's lecture on duty, sacrifice, and the family they lost in Despot Wars. Let's look at the piece of dialogue and how the author is building this story. One scene at a time. We're getting from character to character. We're getting from a conflict between military rank to a family bond, or at least trying to bond to one another. Talk about that just a little bit. That scene, did it leave any impression on you?
I would say that oddly enough, this scene felt cool, but as the comics go on, it felt like a little bit of a non-starter for me, which is rare in these issues. I found that when this happens, you feel like it's really big and really important, and they do come back to it a little bit in one of the later issues. But I found that this, in my view, with Tasha as a character, I find this sets up a certain amount where it's meant to show she's really conflicted between sort of the Jedi and her dad sort of crime lordy stuff. And it feels like, she's in real conflict, But unfortunately, from this point, she has no conflict whatsoever. There's one other conversation with her dad, and then there's never a time where she's actually in conflict. It just keeps saying, it seems like she is, but then you look at her and there's not anything there. So I would say that in this, I unfortunately felt like it was building up to something. I thought her character was going to be a lot more prominent in these issues. And there was going to be like almost a choice, kind of like a big choice between this or that. And that unfortunately doesn't really happen. So I think the setup for this is good, but considering how many pages it takes up, especially in issue 2, and how, I'm just looking at it myself, I think it's like 6 or 7 pages. So it's a decent chunk of this issue. For me, I found, although it's written very well and showing the dynamic is very good, unfortunately, I did actually find this might be one of the weaker parts of the whole series for me, just because I got really quite invested into a character of conflict, and I didn't feel her character conveyed that necessarily.
Gotcha.
I don't know if that was even answering your question.
For me, no, it absolutely answers it. I think the way you laid it out, I couldn't have done a better job. That's why we have Mike here. No, but honestly, I just felt that, there's always an observation from the audience's standpoint that, if there's a setup here, I must get the reward over there. If you're telling me something about this character, I must get something else. There's always this kind of relationship back and forth between the storyteller and somebody who absorbs the story. I started realizing I'm a lot more lenient with fictional literature, and Star Wars is I'm not necessarily looking for the ultimate reward in it. I don't know if it's a good or a bad trait of mine, but what I got from this scene, it carried over into something, it translated into something else. I can't quite put a finger on it, but these kind of conflict that you described that she goes through when her passions rise, as we will see later in the issues, when her mood is elevated, or she feels some kind of doubt, or she pauses for a second, when there's that moment of silence and we're trying to figure out what that character is going through, I revert back to the scene. I use that in my own way. I adapt it into my interpretation of the character. So for me, it was really nice to see this, something like Lars Owen has with young Luke in A New Hope, this kind of like fatherly relationship. But I rely on you. Please stay for another season, and so forth. And older Kenobi, right, in Attack of the Clones, when he chastises Anakin, that older father and son relationships. I personally don't look for something that is, again, a building brick that stands later in the story that answers and calls back to that scene. For me, it's like a lot more my irrational side. I'm like, okay, that's what probably I interpret rather than try to see the exact connection.
I see what you're saying. I would push back a smidge and say that with the Owen Luke thing, I think that perfectly conveys where Luke is in his life and where he's feeling
Right.
restrained by Owen. So I think that serves not necessarily Luke's relationship, but it shows one of the best ways to show where a character is in their life or something isn't for the character to just talk at the camera and tell you. It's to show them interacting, especially with a family member or someone, an authority figure, basically being like, I want this. And the reason I can't have this is because of that. And because of that conflict, I then have to take these actions. Exactly. And that work, the original trilogy is absolutely spot on at that. And that's one of the problems, the prequels in a lot of ways. But in Attack of the Clones, there is that dynamic with Anakin and Obi-Wan where Obi-Wan to Anakin is not dissimilar to what Owen was like with Luke. Both Luke and Anakin both feel like they should be doing more, they should be achieving more, and then those interactions show that. Unfortunately, in Attack of the Clones, you then get 2 or 3 scenes where Anakin repeatedly says that exact thing to the camera, even though we got it an hour ago. So in this, I do get what you're saying, and I appreciate that perspective, but I feel like this is, I think her as a character, unfortunately, until the very last arc, the Force War, for me, this character is probably the weak link, Tasha Ryu. I think she's a good, well-written character, and I think she's interesting, but she's the only one where I felt like, oh, she's going to be a real proper main character. And then for parts of these 15 issues, she's just gone. And I'm like, but she's in this initial issue. She's one of the main people who interacts with these Force visions and stuff. And then you're just like, oh, she's just gone. Where? Just out in the background, she's a seer now. And you're like, what? Where did that come from? It's like, oh, that's just what she's doing. And you're like, okay. Oh, yeah, she's not in these 3 issues. So for me, I felt like it was a non-starter because she's her, you've got Shay Cody, you've got hers, and then we've got the subsequent next couple of characters. And she unfortunately takes a bit of a back seat. And I think she gets swapped out for other characters. That's why I said there's kind of 4 main characters, but actually the 4th interchanges because it's swapped between her and then one of the other characters and stuff. That was probably my issue with it. It's on me. I wanted more, so that's on me.
That's totally fine. It's fair. So as Assassin strikes, and during the confrontation, Tasha also sees a vision that we saw before. Now the Baron kills his would-be murderer without hesitation. And although the daughter objects, but the father counters and he says, look, mercy is weakness. We got to do what we got to do. Well, we live in a very tough world and it builds tough character. And he compels her yet again. She says, look, having a Jedi at Rio Clan's side would be indispensable. I need you here by my side. And once again, we see her being torn apart between her loyalty to family and obligations to the Jedi Order. Moving on.
Well, can I add one thing?
Go ahead.
With this dialogue? I will say,
Michael can't let that go.
No, I can't. But one thing that's really good, actually, in the final parts of dialogue is a way to show that a character is a very manipulative character is one line of dialogue. And I think this line of dialogue serves as a better explanation for who this guy is more than anything else in this entire issue. And he says a lot of words as well. And he says to Tasha, I gave you life, Tasha. Don't you love me? And I was like, immediately, if that was one of my parents saying that, it almost wouldn't matter what they were asking me to do. I would defiantly not do it because that kind of idea, I brought you into the world, so you owe me. It's like, I didn't ask to be born. You did it. You did something. I'm in existence now. I know you think I owe you. That's not how this relationship works. And I think that in itself actually shows one of the reasons why she leans far more into the Jedi than into her dad. Not because she is a more moral person, but I think that shows that her dad wants her to be a certain thing for him, for his gain, for his clan. And when you later on, and only in fleeting bits, see what her mum is like, and she's more like, she's going to be who she wants. However she wants to live her life, I support her. That's the reason, in my view, why she leant towards the Jedi. It's not because of the moral side. It's because one of her parents is trying to use her as a tool, and it's saying that you owe me something. And the other parent is going, you live your life, you're an individual. And I think that line of dialogue is very deliberate and very clever. And I very much appreciate that part.
And I would say in Father's defense that, it's a perfect study of our human flaws, that we may intend well, we may mean well, but we may not express it in the right and delicate way. And obviously, again, he's like a crime lord, right? They live in a very tough world, and he can't dispense with pleasantries or be kind or compassionate or even patient with her. It's like, look, I need you. I gave you life. Stand by my side. Pay back what is due. You know, I invested my life into you. Now it's your time to answer. So again, I'm not justifying him or saying he is this wonderful, you know, piece of a character, but it's something that to observe and something we can relate to in real life.
100%.
Moving on, again, we are at Qui-Gon Cache. By the way, I love these names, guys. They just sound so freaking cool. And it's the Temple of Force Learning in the heart of the Silent Desert. And we see a hotshot, literally red-skinned Sith-raised Jedi, Seknos. He's showing off his lightning skills to the adoring audience, right? There's a female Jedi Journey students. They make some very kind of like direct compliments. Oh, I would like him to mentor me. So kind of shows you the openness and quite a different intimacy relationships that these early Jedi had. And once again, we're plagued by a shadow followed by a violent lightning attack this time. So for him, it's not just a vision, but his own lightning fires back at him. And we see the masters arrive and they shoo the girls away, like, go, 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 go. Okay, there's no laughing matter. And we see the young man, he dreams of adventure and experience, and he relates to his great parents, right? Because it's them who visit him. He says, look, I got to go on an adventure. We always talk about the wisdom and studying the Force. I want action. He's very much channeling Luke in that scene. But his grandparents warn him of rash action without thought. And if I may, we're talking about the story and development so much that I wanted to see something differently here. The visual aspect of Star Wars, which pulls us all in. And I wanted to come back to the design. Because we discussed earlier characters and other journeymen, they're different. And obviously this character, who's a Sith race Jedi, later on we will see them as the Sith Lords, right? The species and other species join them. But what vibes did you get from his character design and specifically his grandparents when they arrive and they see these cowled figures arrive and they immediately draw the eye and they demand attention?
I think what's clever about the visuals in this is it shows his age without telling you. You know, with human characters and to a degree as well, Twi'leks and a lot of the near human characters, you can convey age very easily because you know what an old person looks like or a young person looks like, and etc. With a character, with a species like the Sith, which is, you know, especially on his face, he's got the sort of the parts of skin that kind of come down. It hides his age a little bit. It makes it harder to see. Obviously, when you see his grandparents and the lines on their face, you can clearly see they're really, really old. But I think the visual side of this, if you did this without any dialogue, this whole scene with Seknos, it would all make clear sense. The text adds layers to it, adds depth. But if you showed this specific part more than probably any of the other ones, without any dialogue, it just makes complete sense. And I think what he's showing off, you know, where he's absolutely shredded and he's, you know, showing off a lot of skin and he's clearly a good looking chap. And he's also pushing himself to do something which you find out very shortly after. No one's really done that. You're not really meant to do that. It's showing he's pushing boundaries. He's young. He's actually a bit, not necessarily naive, but he's arrogant. He thinks that, again, it's a little bit like, you know, Luke, as you said, it's kind of that thing where he's at a level 6 and he thinks he should be in a level like 9. And you're like, dude, you need to, there's steps.
The maximalist use. Yeah.
Exactly. That's how I feel about the design of him. And then when you get the interactions of him with his grandparents, it really shows their relationship with barely any words. I mean, they're only in what, 1, 2, 3, they're in 4 panels. And I think with not that much dialogue and just that interaction, his character almost feels the most flushed out than any of the other characters we've seen so far, just because the visual elements of this are so well done.
Yeah, very effective. And what I was thinking of is when the grandparents arrive, my first thought was Darth Maul, but then I immediately had to shift gears and say, oh, no. We're earlier. These are not Sith. These are the good guys. But I couldn't help but get that feeling of, I'm 80s kid. I grew up with ninja movies. I'm like, space ninjas. Look at the outfits. Like, I was blown away, man. I was just looking at the designs. They're just so cool looking. There's something so interesting about these flowing robes. Obviously, we see it later on with Darth Maul and Vader's cape and stuff. I just thought it was very visually striking, grabs your eye, and obviously all the stuff that you have mentioned adds so much to the scene. And yet again, we end up on this brief but very interesting scene where we meet this stranger, right? This Dagon Locke on Bogan and his vision. And on Tython, we see Shaikota, we see Saknas, and we see Tasharo share the experiences of the same mysterious figure. So now their visions are sort of united. And as they're discussing this, an escape pod crashes right in the middle of this scene, and the Force Hound Zesh has arrived. Their vision is manifested in flesh and blood. And that's how we end this issue. So we have 3 more issues to run through, but run me quickly with just that one final panel. That drawing is just so bold. He drops the air, he's before the face. Was there a moment where you believed, like, hold on a second, too early, this can't be real, this is so striking?
I really enjoyed it, but I feel like I've seen this panel probably 50 times before, to be blunt with you.
Right.
It works and it's effective. But, from when you and I have both respectively spoken with Paolo Villanelli, the artist, and he's an incredible gentleman. When I spoke to him, he mentioned that basically the last panel of almost every comic really has to be striking because it makes you need to read the next issue. And I find with this one, it is really cool. He's just saying the word death and he's holding his helmet and he's got like a strange lightsaber-like thing ignited. And it is striking. But I feel like, unfortunately, due to when this came out, which is sort of 2012, I think, I've not read the most amount of comics, but I've read quite a few. And there's quite a lot of panels which do end with just a badass person standing there and nothing else really around them, especially in some of the modern comics, which I think probably borrow from this as well. So I do like it. But for me, I think the stronger parts of this, this issue was kind of, the interactions now between the characters, like the intertwining of the story for me made it more interesting than seeing this guy come out, to be honest. And I think if he'd have come out with his helmet on to match what the vision showed, and I know the reason they don't do that, it is explained, but I feel like when I was reading this, I was like, why has he got his helmet off? That was my first question. I was like, he's just been in a crash. His helmet's not damaged. In fact, it's literally shining. Why is he taking it off?
Well, as we're going to learn in the next issue, his arrival is not quite what he would himself expect it to be, right? But when this issue came out, I remember flipping the page. Obviously, he's an awesome looking character. I was a bit concerned, like, okay, I hope this is not another instance of this lowbrow villain that's like a single kind of like thing, and he's like, I'm evil, I'm going to defeat everyone. So I was a little bit concerned and eagerly anticipating the next issue to see what was going on. The plot thickens. Issue 3. We are on a Karkash Temple of Balance. And Master Kato and Raja Rory Fenn examine the disturbance they felt. They must examine this crashed ship. And the Jedi confront the Hound. We see lightsaber versus Maddox steel sword clash, right? As the Jedi Masters are trying to figure out what is happening, our youngsters are here already in the thick of combat. And the Jedi use all of their force techniques available to them to defeat this foe. And Seknas actually manages to steal the energy sword, but what's going on? He can't activate it, right? Because the Jedi are obviously not at that stage. That technology is not available to them. And the attacker actually realizes that he's outmatched, and he makes his escape. It is a massive 11-page combat scene. Let's talk about the action. Just what was your impression of what you were like just looking at on these pages?
I could feel every punch. It felt like there were sound effects. I know there are literal written sound effects as well, but like this for me, once I started reading this elevated it a bit more for me. Not necessarily because of the action, but the action is phenomenal. I mean, the art style of this is amazing. The fact that one thing that comic artists can sometimes struggle with a little bit, or at least I struggle with them, is you get action scenes and it feels like there's bits missing sometimes. Whereas or sometimes a bit hard to follow when there's like a really close up fighting scene, and it happens in movies as well, unfortunately, where you struggle to see what's happening. But I found with this scene, for the most part, it all coherently made sense. So it was easy to follow. It looks amazing. I can feel the impact. This was when you mentioned earlier about, when you get really absorbed into something. This was one of the ones where I wasn't consciously processing I'm reading a comic. My brain was just processing it, and I was just, as soon as I get to the end, next bit. It like almost my heart was racing because it was so intense. And so I think the start of this was boom. It really hits hard. And what I love about it as well with the action is that this also shows a lot about the characters, not just Zesh, but also Seknos, Shay, and Tasha. Says how she's so forgettable. I keep forgetting her name. I always remember her surname. But I think that this is like I feel like these 11 pages could really be shown to any prospective comic artists to go like, this is how you do an action scene. It's coherent, it's hard hitting. You've got the small panels when it's necessary, but you've got the big panels when it makes an impact. I love different panel sizing. I love people when they experiment with different panels and things rather than it just being the standard, in the old school days where it was just a 6 in exactly the same size. That can work really well, like it does in Batman Killing Joke, but I like differences. I like that. And I just think that from the start of this issue, I found the first page bluntly was a bit boring, but I did find that the actual action incredible. I really, really loved every element of this, not just the action, but the actions of the characters and what that actually says about them as characters. That's what I really, really enjoyed. And as you say, with the youngsters, the old ones are just standing there kind of talking about stuff, and the youngsters are in there doing it. And that's a real foreshadowing of how this whole series goes. So I think the first half of this issue is very, very powerful in a variety of different ways.
Mm-hmm. And for me, I wanted just to add on the technical front of it. It once again shows the comic book artist and writer's mastery. There's oftentimes I would flip pages of a book as I was, checking out some, especially indie comic books, where it tries to be very experimental and they're trying to apply different Photoshop techniques, not in a cheap way, but in what they feel is effective way. But you can immediately tell apart where somebody has no concept of how to do these action scenes. In this one, there's a great sense of spatial awareness, angles, volume, depth, kineticism, speed, character poses, which are very dynamic, very striking, not necessarily entirely believable because they're all basically like doing matrix poses and they're jumping around. It's very amplified and exaggerated, but it's done in a way that is so tasteful and so deliberate and so convincing that I absolutely loved it. The friends plan their next actions. For reasons of their own, they decide to follow their curry, and they discover their attacker. Now, the Jedi fighters fly over the crashed Rakata ship. They're doing their own investigation. And back on Cali's Temple of Knowledge, the Twi'lek Korra examines the evidence. And a crashed ship's Force-sensitive victims are the cause of this abyss rift. And these creatures emerge from the ground and the Force storm is gathering. This series looks at the Force from quite different angles than we've seen before. What is your view on the Force storm?
So the Force storm was actually something that I initially did struggle with. That's one of the parts I struggled with. It was hard to tell kind of, I know it's part of the mystery, but obviously the part of the mystery is what caused this. And in this, it's explaining, it's this, there's a disturbance in the Force basically, and the planet's kind of reacting to it. But I found that all, on the first read at least, quite confusing. I was like, I'm not understanding fully what they're on about. I couldn't wrap my head around how is one person on a planet make all this stuff happen. And I think once you get to the end of the issue, it really shows that it's not just this one person coming down. It's kind of a foreshadowing effect of like
of all the victims that crashed on that ship.
Yeah, it's like when because obviously at this point you don't know. They do mention, there's some people who died, and there's the crew as well as there's other people on board.
And
it's not
Typhon is a Force strong planet.
exactly. But it's not till later on I found that it really shows the weight, because even I remember reading these first ones and I was like, I don't even understand how big the ship was. I thought when I saw the escape pod come out, I was like, that didn't seem like a very big ship.
Mhm.
And then afterwards it goes, oh, it's actually quite big. And then in one of the later issues, it shows the events that occurred that had happened for that. But for me, that's the bit that I struggle with a little bit, which was actually understanding the literal gravity and weight of what was happening and why it was being caused. That for me was one of those parts I mentioned earlier, which is why I had to reread it a bit. I don't know if for you it was more clear on your first read.
I can't quite point in the beginning if it was clear because again, I was reading one issue at a time, so I can't really recall that. But I can make a comparison to the Star Wars modern comic books, where those issues where I believe in the mainline Star Wars comic where Yoda goes to this force sensitive mountain, which ends up being a creature, an entity. And I was extremely frustrated. It was one of the books that just basically broke the camel's back for me. I said, I'm done with modern books for a while because I couldn't, no matter as hard as I tried, I couldn't draw a connection between that and how that relates to the greater themes of the Force or Star Wars storytelling in general. It just felt so inconsequential and out of whack, and trying to be this pseudo intellectual philosophical just didn't amount to everything. And maybe I sound like a stark defender of the Dark Horse era comic books, but in this particular instance, it just made sense from this angle for me. And again, maybe it's just me drawing symbolism out of Star Wars like all of us fans like doing. I thought it was a very simple and clear tool to show a world in chaos and turmoil. It is both literal and a motif. So yes, there is a force storm. Why? They're going to tell you later on, because all of these people that crashed on this ship, they were force sensitive. Remember how Obi-Wan Kenobi reacts to Alderaan being destroyed? He senses that across time and distance. It hits him. Millions of lives have been extinguished. Well, here it's not millions of lives, but you have it's exacerbated by a planet that is too sensitive to these forces. And it's very easy to topple that balance. And when it does occur, for me, it's just like, when Joseph Campbell talks about the symbology through visual storytelling and visual symbols, that's what this is. It's a literal storm, and it's a storm in regards to where a war is coming. You just don't know it yet.
Yeah, I think that was a bit I struggled with, because this is the strength of some of these comics and the weakness of them as well is that you really have to read them all. And when I first started reading them, I really hated the fact that this is a completely new new era of Star Wars. Obviously, when the canon got reset, it's because that's why it's only these sort of 15, 16 issues in the book. But I was like, even the reading order is not clear. It doesn't say Dawn of the Jedi, Volume 1, The Force Storm. It just says Dawn of the Jedi, The Force Storm. So when you first pitched these to me, for me to read them, I didn't know if they were just, here's a new era, and each mini-series is its own story. And I think that the problem I suffered with this is if I was buying these and I was reading these, I would be like, we're on issue 3 and I still don't really understand what's going on. Is issue 5 going to be a big wrap-up issue? But actually, you finish 5, and then it's like, no, actually, there's more stuff coming. And you're like, but why have you not made these numerical? I don't understand. They are, if you read the subsequent to the Prisoner of Bogon or Force War, if you read them and you haven't read this, it will make a loose sense.
Yeah, it's one series.
It has to be. And it sort of frustrated me a little bit, because I was like, this whole thing is called The Force Storm, and it's meant to explain the Force Storm, and it actually doesn't really until not even the next arc. It's like the final arc. So this is like a film trilogy, except instead of Star Wars calling it episodes 1, 2, 3, they just don't.
So the marketing could have been done a little bit better.
Potentially. That's I think what frustrated me a little bit. I know that's not a direct connection to the story, but yeah, for me, I didn't find it was clear enough. But that might just be because, again, it's so dense and there's new characters and there's new Force stuff, interpretations of the Force. Tython is quite new, as well as you've got several storylines intertwining going on at once. You've got the metaphorical elements, you've got the literal elements, you've got philosophical questions which are being reacted to by a living kind of planet. And I'm like, this is so much information to take in. I think the in-depth symbolism only comes through on the second or even third read, to be honest.
And it could be overbearing sometimes. Yeah, I agree with you. I totally get the criticism. I totally see how, if you're not well-versed on how to proceed reading these, it could be very intimidating, especially for, a beginner reader. Moving on, I think the next question I'm going to ask you will be one of my favorites that I had in this first 5 issue run. So we are the crash site, and the Jedi study the ship's debris. And there's symbols they read in Arabic which state Predol Tulkar. Oops! He's the dude that went down with the ship, apparently. And they trace the footsteps of their Jedi journeyman, right? And Butch, the flying Rancor dragon, she's alive. She comes back. And Master Korra senses dark emotions. And they decide to take the flying mounts into the storm, trying to find their young chargers, their students. So the narrative shifts now from students to their masters. They enter the fold and they're here in full swing. And at this point, we are getting a broader overall theme. What do you think it is?
I think part of it is what it's trying to say in a commentary sort of sense is that the masters are spending too much time sitting and thinking as opposed to feeling the Force. All the young people, they're just like, I feel something, let's go. And although they're being quite foolhardy about it and they get themselves into trouble, they are the reasons why everything, good or bad really, happens across these issues is because of this small group of people just going with it. The Force is telling me to go that way. I'm going to go. Whereas a lot of the masters are like, okay, the Force is telling me to go that way. Let's wait. Let's scope the area. Let's check this thing. Let's check that thing. Let me check this. Let me check that. Let me talk to that guy. Let's talk to that guy. Let's have a conference about it. Right, we've all had a thing. Now let's take 10 steps forward and do the same again over and over and over again. And although the masters, you can clearly show they are very experienced, they are very knowledgeable, I think this is trying to show a bit of symmetry between the follies of the Jedi Council in the prequels, which is a common theme in these. It shows that history repeats itself. The people who've been in power for a long period of time and are very wise and stuff, they're kind of stuck in their ways a little bit. And although I think that the masters here, you can tell by the dialogue and their Force abilities are very powerful, and I very much enjoy the way they interact with the riding mount and the Rancor. I like that dynamic. It shows that they are human. Well, they're not human technically. Two of them are human.
They're people.
You know what I mean? They're people. That's a better way of putting it. Mm-hmm. So because they're people and you can connect with them and they are all individual, I really like that element. But I think it's trying to kind of show the difference between these two groups of individuals. And considering Sesh is, I know this isn't specifically about Sesh, but because he is a young as well, and I think the Rakata, the Praedors, the Praedor Rakata, I think are a parallel in some ways to the Jedi Masters, and then Zesh and the young Jedi sort of journeyers and things, they are the new generation. And I think it's trying to show how a world or even a galaxy can shift because of different mentalities and actions by a younger generation compared to their older counterparts. That's at least how I interpret it, but I'd love to hear what you think.
When I read books, especially short fiction, where there's economy of word, and, Robert E. Howard is perhaps my favorite English author because he manages to get so much done just within one paragraph that it takes literally all the author's entire chapters to do, literally. And there are certain moments where it is especially crystallized and emerges very prominently in short storytelling, where the story all the elements just lock in, like, I get it. I understand the journey you're taking me on. And in this one, after this particular scene, the entire book series was locked in for me. I was ready for the ride. Maybe certain characters would resolve the way I didn't anticipate or want. Maybe artists would get replaced in further issues, as often happens with Star Wars books. Fortunately, here, Yando Shema, she made the Stuff of Legend here. But regardless, what this particular scene did for me, it established a very clear theme of character is forged in conflict. And where's the conflict? Here's the storm. It doesn't get bigger than this. And in this storm, there's this contest between youth and the eagerness of youth versus experience. I was like, oh, this happened. I was like, oh, I'm ready. Let's go.
Amazing. I'm glad we in a lot of ways interpreted thematically similar elements of it is the old and the new, whether it's the old ways and the new ways, the old generation, the new generation, whatever it is. I think we both succinctly, well, you more succinctly than I did, kind of made that comparison.
So we're wrapping this issue up with the young adventurers following their target to the abyss of Ra. And bickering and teasing each other along the way. We see some friction going on there. They're frustrated. There's mud and then swamps all around them. And the hunted force hound is dazed and wounded himself. He's also struggling on his own. He's confused what caused his ship to crash. And he falls unconscious, and the scene shifts to the dark moon of Bogan yet again. And we see this mysterious character, Dagon. He keeps sensing this power. The book's endings are punctuated by this obviously mysterious man, as I mentioned, but what do his scenes actually add to the propelling the plot?
For me, I mean, first of all, I love Dagon Locke. He's really interesting. I know it won't be to the next set of comics until we really delve into his character a bit more. But I think what I like about it is he seems to be the only person who can see a few steps ahead, because everyone else is seemingly reacting to what's happening right now. And he is seemingly the only person to be like, it's not what's happening now, it's what's happening now, what that's going to do. And I think that's what it's kind of conveying to the audience. It's going, look, yeah, we can see that someone's chasing someone in like a acidy wasteland. Yeah, that's not the plot. That's not the story. This is just a catalyst. You don't really see what's actually coming is so much bigger, so much more important. And the force storm on Tython and the visual imagery, I think, along with Dagon's very specific small amount of dialogue and the little bit of sort of bubbles to explain what he's kind of doing, what he's thinking, I think that they marry together in a way to show foreshadowing and to bring excitement of what's to come while being cryptic enough to keep you hook, line, and sinker. You know, not just going, this is going to happen. Stay tuned, kids. It's more like something is, and if you pay attention enough, you can kind of figure it out. But we're not going to give you too much. It's that really, for me, it's that great balance, I'd say.
Yeah, for me, I can't quite put a, recollect my memory how I was reacting to him in real time and as I was reading the books. But now in retrospect, you hit the nail on the head. You know, it's the audience always loves the type of character who knows more than the rest of the heroes do. There's this very empowering and cool feeling. Oh, well, they don't know, but he does. And once again, is that the relationship between the eagerness of youth versus the Jedi Masters, who are also dealing with it in real time, versus this guy who he's almost like Christ in a desert, who has been already tempted by the devil. He's been through the extremity of this experience, and he's on the other side of the hill, and he's saying, I know where this is going. And there's this calmness about him and awareness of what's to come. You just can't wait to like, where's the next issue? I want it now. He's a very, very cool character. Issue 4. At the Akarkash Temple, the Jedi assemble to discuss a powerful force storm, the likes of which has only been seen 10,000 years ago. This overwhelming sense of darkness coming. And the dark side permeates the ship wreckage, which they have studied. And they learned that their journeymen, Tasha Rio, Shai Koda, and Seknas Roth, are following the leads, and the masters decide to gather and meditate to dissipate the storm. Now, I loved the scene of the masters coming together, and it's quite different from when we see the Jedi Council assemble in Star Wars prequel, which was an awesome visual of different masters of different eras coming together and communing with one another. What was your thought of their council and how it pushed the story forward.
I think one of the things visually it tells quite well is that because they're all communicating via Hollow, they're all in very different places. And one of the things I really like about this series is, and it gets explored a lot more in the Into the Void book, which again I read before all of this, and I think that book really helped me understand the vastness of the world of Tython. And I really like they're all from different schools and they've all got their own kind of specialities and stuff, and they all kind of come together in theory to make a full picture. And I like that they're all quite, I think visually, because it's all on hologram, they're all quite separate. And I feel like that's kind of deliberate because I think in the prequels, you see as the Clone Wars go on, masters are being dragged to random places in the universe, and there's less and less of them actually there in the council chambers, and more of them are there via Hollow. So there's that degree of disconnect that I think is quite a clever, at least the way I interpret it, storytelling device. But when it comes from like the actual dialogue and what they're saying, I feel like they are kind of being used just to advise the audience what's going on. I think it's a clever idea. I think it's better than just having like a giant crawl of text and going, this is what's happening. But I would say I was interested by some of these, but I was like, oh, that guy looks really cool. I want to see him again. And then I don't think he's in it again. So I liked it, but I was kind of, because I was of the privilege of, I didn't have to wait for these. I could just go to the next one. I was just kind of like, I want to know more about Zesh and who this Dagon Lock is. I just want to, I'm too eager. The last issue was such a cliffhanger and so exciting. I'm like, I just want to delve right in. And there's like, no, wait a sec. We need to tell you these things. It's important. I'm the young, brash Jedi, Jedi journeyers. I'm like, no, I don't care. Just, I want to dive in.
Yeah, it speaks to the, I think it only speaks, these type of scenes where they sort of interrupt the tension is, we see a lot of that in the original Thrawn trilogy. And I think it speaks to the power of the story and that the storyteller got you in his grip and he's controlling your emotions, where you sort of want to get to the next part, but you don't want to skip the book forward because you can't do that. You have to read what's in front of you. And then it's interesting in its own right. But just a small little mental note on this particular scene. It spoke of a more innocent age for the Jedi, where the prequel era Jedi are burdened with this republic which is rotting from within, and they're too blindsided to see it, not through faults of their own, or maybe some of it was also they're partially complicit, but that's the hand they were dealt with. But in here, it's a more innocent age where the Jedi come together, no politics, no bureaucracy. Oh, this is what needs to be done. Let's go. Like you said, it's an effective narrative point to say, boom, we're here now. That's where we need to go. Let's keep exploring this avenue. Maybe we'll find traces of our students, and we keep going.
That's a good point. Yeah, I agree.
In the Raw Abyss, the Jedi students witness the raging storm. And Shaikota has a vision of her parents who abandoned her. And she has this outburst of rage, as any human being would have. And the friends are all emotionally compromised. They overcome their differences and recite the Jedi teaching, which is quite different. And as you mentioned earlier, it's a combination sort of like of what would become later on Sith and the Jedi teachings. But elsewhere in the Abyss, Zesh is tormented by the same storm. And he relives the moments of the ship's crash, and he realizes that he's the one that killed his master. Now, the personal challenges that the friends are facing are paralleled with this Force Hound. What can we draw from these two separate scenes?
That's a very good question. For me, I think it's about the corruption of the dark side. That's how I interpret it. Because what I love so much about the interactions between the three journeyers is the dark side twists them each in slightly different ways. And again, the visuals, like there's that shot which you get Shay where half her face is in shadow and the other half isn't, and that's that's used quite a lot in Star Wars and in other mediums as well. But I think that with their thing, they've got balance, and it shows that if they fall into the darkness, they've got an individual, either a friend of theirs or something, or their knowledge of the light side of the Force to bring them balance. And that's the whole theme of this entire, Dawn of the Jedi, the whole kind of collection is all about balance, is not tipping too far into one or the other. And I think with Zesh, it's kind of showing that he's only ever known the dark side, and it's got him to a breaking point where he doesn't really know what he's done. He's done this horrible atrocity. He's put himself in this position. He's alone. And I think it's trying to show that balance is necessary, and that if you've got someone or something, you just need an anchor point of some degree to help bring you back if you go too far. And for me, I think that's what the story of this and probably the whole of the Dawn of the Jedi is kind of trying to convey, of that kind of thing where you need balance. Everyone's balance is found in different ways. Some people like Hawk Ryo, he can just kind of look inward for the most part. He delves into the dark a bit too much, and then he brings himself back. With these other characters, they had to have Tasha to bring them back. And I think that Zesh doesn't have anyone to do this. So in this issue and this part is kind of showing him almost spiraling, and he's kind of hit rock bottom. And now it's like, what are you going to do from here? You have to find your own anchor point. We've just seen how people get out of the dark side. How is he going to do it? That's at least my interpretation of it, but I'd love to hear yours.
First of all, I absolutely loved the concept of Ashla and Volga. Not only the Dawn of the Jedi has amazingly interesting names, just the way they sound, the just pronouncing them is really cool. But this whole idea of light not existing without the dark, and when you speak of the balance, you sort of like visualize this equal scale where you have your evil and you have your good here. And from one perspective, when you look at the original trilogy, it's as if to every evil that is Vader, a hero must arise to combat evil. And that's what balance is. In this scene, what I really enjoy, it's quite a different note there. It's saying that there is good in Zesh, and there's a drop of evil in our journeyman, and they can't exist without having that inner Satan within them that they have to constantly wrestle with, right? Because in Jewish Hebrew theology, there is no Satan. There is no horned beast who will tempt you. That's Satan, what we call, it's inside of you. It's inside each human being. And it is your duty, it's your obligation, if you want to mature, if you want to grow, if you want to be a spiritual being, is to recognize it and combat it. That's what Zesh is doing. He's confronting his past, right? Later on, we're going to get in issue 5 of this battle arena. But in the good guys, right? The traumatic experience with family. My parents, they have abandoned me. That you cannot exist as a being of light without recognizing there's also darkness within you.
And the way I visualize that is very, very in a very simple sense, which is the yin and the yang.
Yeah.
Which is when I perceive that, you've got the light kind of curve with a dot of dark in it, and vice versa. And for me, when it comes to Star Wars and just general philosophical life stuff, I generally perceive it as everyone has got the yin and the yang in different amounts in all of them, but no one has none of one. No one
Exactly.
does. And I think is what you're saying. It really shows in this. And I think that these two really show as well. I think one of the parallels is trauma, is that the trauma can change people in different ways. And I think with Zesh, it's kind of like the sheer amount of trauma he's experienced got him to such a breaking point. He's just snapped.
Yeah.
And then his mind has almost become wiped from the sheer volume of trauma and stuff he's been through. And now he's kind of like a broken man, blank slate. And this issue really shows that there's the line of dialogue when you see him walk. It's only a small panel as well, where he's walking and he's kind of holding these ripped bits of the webbing after the spiders. And it says to survive, he must escape, not only from whatever creatures lie in wait of this world, but what lies within his own exhausted mind. And then you see like zombified versions of like the Rakata. And I was like, oh, bravo. That the visuals there and the dialogue, it really speaks. Those like one sentence or so speak so much more than like a paragraph of exposition could. And I just think it works so well on showing exactly where Zesh is now. This issue is one of my favorites of all 15, excluding 0 because it's like an encyclopedia. Of all 15, this is one of my favorites because you get to know the character and it really unravels who on earth he is, why he was doing what he's doing, and where loosely he's going to go from here. And I think this scene in particular really shows him physically ripping out of the web is him physically shedding his own, not only mental sort of webbing and entrapment and the ropes and the binds that tie him down, but also the connection to the Dark Empire that's holding him back. And I just think on so many levels, it works so well.
Yeah. Talking about symbology, because you and I, we did touch upon how comic books are a craft or an economy, and you have so little room just to put it all together. And I really enjoyed that in the scene that you're describing, how there are these two very powerful gears that move the vehicle of storytelling forward, where on one side it's action, and in the action you always have interspersed word bubbles that convey what the characters are feeling and going through. Nothing is ever done for the sake of spectacle in this comic. Nothing is done to say, look at my cool pose, I'm Neo with a lightsaber, I'm just gonna kick your ass to the moon and back. I don't like it. It's shallowness. It's after the cool factor is gone, you forget stories like this in a moment. You just literally toss them into the garbage bin. In here, what you mentioned on, maybe the rest of the story doesn't land itself the way that you want to, but the books and comics stick with me for many years after because of memorable scenes like this one.
Very good. Yeah, I agree completely.
So moving on in this chapter, we are in search of the youngsters, right? The Quan Jang is revealed to be Daigon Locke's former master, right? Our Bogon stranger, we'll call him for now. And his student went mad in the Ruh Abyss. So that place is a place of darkness for them. But the master promises not to lose his apprentice, Shai Koda, that he's obligated to her and make sure to see her safely through this. Now, inside the rift, Masters Rory and Hawk search for the trail of the students. They recall their romantic past briefly, but they're wary not to pursue it, to succumb to their base emotions, particularly in this place. Just very briefly touch on how this dynamic of we can't fall in love is different from prequel era, obviously Anakin and Padme.
I think with the prequel era, it's all about worrying about getting punished. Whereas in this, it's all about we have a more important thing to deal with. We can't do this because we, or at least she, is choosing not to. So I could go that way, but I have a duty. Duty first, my own personal pleasure second. Whereas I think in the prequels, it's like you are allowed no personal pleasure of any kind, and it's so repressive that they won't have any give. And because of that, if it's such an absolutist, it's all or nothing in the prequel era Jedi, that's when you get characters like Anakin who only want half of it. They don't need the whole world. They want their little thing. And the Jedi go, nope. So it's like, well, all or nothing. I'm going to have it all. And obviously he results in having nothing. So I think that this really shows that the dogma of the Jedi Order hinders personal growth in a lot of ways, because Anakin is constantly repressed and cannot grow as a person in a lot of ways because he's never taught to process emotion. He talks to Yoda. I'm getting visions of people that are dying. And Yoda goes, don't worry about it. You just got to disconnect and not care about them anymore. It's like, of course, Yoda. It's like if I was depressed and went to Yoda, he's like, just don't be sad. And I'm like, oh, you've cured. Thank you, Yoda. How do I get over the loss of a loved one? Just don't care about them anymore. Thank you. I'm cured. No, that doesn't work. Yeah. Whereas in this, it really shows, no, it's not because someone's told us we can't. It's because I want to commit to my duty more than you. And I think that's a very choosing to not be with someone for a reason is completely different than being told or being forced to not. And I think that's, again, very deliberate.
Yeah. I mean, you just spelled it all out for us. But, in the prequel era, you look at this and my feelings. We spoke about prequels at length. It's one of my biggest gripes, this celibate monks, this almost fanatical devotion to a religion. And that's your only commitment. And you honestly have no say in it because you're taken in as an infant. It's not your decision to become a Jedi. It's just, you're force sensitive. Come here, kid. Let's go. Let's go. You're going to be a fine Jedi. Boom, just slap on the shoulder. It kind of makes you wonder how years prior to Palpatine and Anakin's coming, how some other Force powerful Jedi just didn't go ape shit and like, I can't handle this anymore. Just all his screws get loosed in his brain. We're laughing at it, but it's the truth. That's the reality of it. What have the Jedi Order has lost along the way to adapt this kind of very extreme view? Because, and I'm gonna make this little critique of George Lucas's writing style. Again, we worship George Lucas. He is the grandfather, but we can still look at the art and make some points there. And I think what the Dawn of the Jedi comic book is doing is exactly the kind of ideas that George Lucas was homebrewing, but didn't fully develop for the trilogy. You don't need to have celibate monks to have a rift in a relationship or have a dramatic, traumatic experience that compels you to do something devastating. What's really interesting about these two Jedi when they're talking about their relationship, and it's not, there is no absolutes in their language. She's not completely cutting him off. In their prior relationship, it feels like there wasn't a mystery to anybody. Jedi can have personal relationships. What I felt was very well done here and earned. She's saying, look, it's not that I'm duty bound, that I'm like almost in this modern age. The comparison would be a young woman who is so hell bent on her personal career that she forgoes any notions of being a mother of a household. She's so compelled to pursue the career and prove everybody wrong. It's not the example here. The example is she's like, hold on a second, hit pause. Do you see what's going on around us? We're on the brink of something, on the precipice of something so dangerous. Let's hold up. I don't think emotions are going to help us here. This is not the time to rekindle our passion, which, as we know, whether you take the old era or the new era, passions always lead you astray. And I just felt it was really interesting moment there. Mm-hmm. So the Force Hound is on the run from the beasts. He remembers his time in the gladiator arena on the Abyss, and he fought for the Rakata Empire's master's pleasure, and he draws on his hatred to survive. Now, the parallel action scene where two concurrent events are happening all at the same time shows us the arena and him at the same time escaping the Abyss creatures, right? These worms coming from the ground, and he's fighting them off. But now the cavalry has arrived. And Seknos throws a rock at the creature, and they say, come on, let's group together. Let's the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That sort of thing. And the friends and their mortal enemy actually combine their forces, and they make their escape. Now, I loved this parallel action scene, and I just wanted to see what impression it left in you. If I may begin first, I did throw this question at you, but I just really loved how it accomplished the 2-in-1, because it was an effective method to develop this character, where it's showing me two things happening at the same time, which had a great influence on him.
Yeah, I mean, I do love that. I will say that my favorite element of this action scene, which might be jumping ahead a smidge, is when he is actually looking and he's predicting what he thinks everyone's going to do, and he's completely wrong. That, for me, that's one of the strongest parts of this entire issue. I love that part because, yeah, I mean, I do love parallels. I really do like it. I've even got a note specifically on my notebook which says, Sesh's backstory is shown in tandem to present day and is expanded upon throughout all of the comics, which I really like. While also the different beasts on Tython as well, which is cool to show the diversity and further evidences what was said in the first issue, which is it's a really dangerous place if you're not Force sensitive, especially. So I think it does show that Sesh can take care of himself, and it shows why. It's not just, oh, he's a badass. It's like, no, he's literally fought to the death just for pleasure. And it's insinuated numerous times. This isn't his first or his last fight. It's indicated the flashbacks you see. He's got scars all over him when he starts the fight, and you see he's got the scars on him more than he gets in this fight afterwards. I think in a later issue. So I like that you've got the parallels there of the telling a story in a clever way and in being economical with the pages. You've got the different styles of how the Jedi fight together compared to how Darksiders fight. Darksiders are all for me, whereas the Jedi are working as a team in tandem. Yeah. But yeah, for me, the real standout is when Sesh takes a bit of a backseat And he's like, oh yeah, they clearly only saved me because they want the pleasure of my kill. And it's not that at all. And his, again, instead of him just overtly telling us he doesn't trust people, what it cleverly does is gets rid of someone looking into the audience and going, this is what's happening. And it's instead of doing this, it's going, you look over there, and there's two things interacting together, and witnessing that tells you far more about both sides than what the character could tell you, even if they were overtly telling you. And that's what I love when he's seeing what's going on and he's got this conflict and he's like, oh, they're going to kill me. Oh, they're not. Maybe I should help. But why should I? Why would I help? And the conflict of Zesh in this entire issue, in this scene, really sends ripples, I think, across the entirety of this series. I think this issue and this, I like seeing his backstory. I thought that was very cool. But this scene of how he interacts with the Jedi and showing how he can grow to kind of trust them in a certain way is different to a lot of other villains, because a lot of villains go, working as a team makes you weak, so I won't do it. Zesh doesn't even have the comprehension that someone would work as a team. It's not that he's bad because he's looked at the good side and gone, no, thank you. It's that he's never even comprehended that there is an air quotes good side. And again, the mastery of the visuals you see of just Zesh's body language and how he's kind of looking at the others and how they're struggling to fight this thing, mixed with the dialogue of his own internal kind of monologue going, it works so well. And that's one of the reasons why, again, this issue is one of my favorites across all 15, because it's amazing.
And I really, really hope that my outlook on, I've read a decent portion of modern comic books, but the main reason I left them is because I was finding a severe lack of what's in this, what we're talking about this very moment, where there's this subtext and interest. And I really hope he changes my mind. But closing off with issue 4, previously we talked about the scene where he's like, I am death. I'm just gonna kick everybody's ass. He's like so stoic, and it's too much of a familiar of a panel. This one is, I loved how manipulative it is. Because we're supposed to hate this guy. And now he is, instead of walking into the foreground, he's turning his back on these guys who are desperately in trouble. And he's like, why should I? I'm gonna walk off. And at least I, as a reader, was like, bro, you're gonna do us dirty like this? Come on, man. You're kicking ass. You're the only one who got the lightsaber. Let's go. What the hell is stopping you? You sort of inadvertently begin to kind of cheer for him. Not that he's a good guy, but you're supposed to be temporary allies, at least for a little bit. Pretend, please. And it just left me wanting so much more.
You want to see where his journey goes and how he gets there, and if or how his mindset changes. And I think that it's when you find out how, I have mixed feelings on that. But this scene specifically, especially where you've got Shay calling out, going, Zesh, what are you doing? Help us. Yeah. And he's kind of walking away, looking kind of badass, going, one world, one fight, arena rules always apply. I'm like, okay, that's him trying to cut himself off again. That's him still sticking to his old ways. Yeah. And then, it's like, end of the issue. What next? And it's like, well, I assume he's going to turn around, but if he didn't, I could, with this, because it's quite, again, we keep making those comparisons of Game of Thrones stuff, is that in Game of Thrones, one of the draws for me, and again, I've only watched the series and the House of the Dragon stuff, is the draws for me is that no character is actually overtly safe.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest problem I find with a lot of the modern Star Wars at the moment, is the lack of original characters in, like, outside of the movies, unless they're a titular character. I love Dr. Aphra, but when a comic series is called Dr. Aphra and it's, issue 14 is obviously not the final issue, she can't possibly die. So there's a degree of dramatic tension that gets taken out of that. When you read certain other issues which are about Luke Skywalker or Anakin or Obi-Wan, the dramatic tension's gone because they can only have a certain amount of wounds and things. With this, genuinely, if you watched him just watch them, the Masters haven't been, like, I think deliberately the Masters haven't really been shown for the last sort of few panels. So I was thinking, when I finished this, I was like, what if he leaves them and then the Masters come in to save him? That's the beauty of this, is that the possibilities are actually borderline endless.
And
As
believable.
opposed to a certain other comics that you read, and it's just like, well, this can't happen, this can't happen, this can't happen, this can't happen. So the only option is this, or maybe this. And that's what I like about this. Again, it's because it's new, fresh characters and stuff, but because of the mystery of Zesh and his constantly changing motivations, it means that you are drawn in to read more because it's unpredictable. That's what I like.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Folks, are you ready? Issue 5. We're about to conclude here. Big. The High Republic. Loden Grainstorm. No, wait. different series. Different things happened there. We're going to stay quiet on this one. Talking about Game of Thrones. Yes, the Dawn of the Jedi. Issue 5. Sorry, guys. We had to orient ourselves a little bit here. The Force Storm rages on. The Jedi Masters reunite in their search for their journeyman students. Meanwhile, the students fight off the abyss creatures as their betrayer, Force Hound Zesh, observes the battle from distance, right? You obviously hit a little bit further into it, but he makes the mental notes, he makes predictions in comparison, who is the weakest link here, who's gonna drop first, very, very cynical attitude. And he witnesses Shai Kotis conquer her fears and face the odds, face her mortal enemy. And that's what changes him around, and he joins the battle. Now, again, I want to come back to how the book balances action and storytelling. What stands out when you see this scene in comparison to modern Star Wars books?
I think that in part because of where Star Wars was when this was coming out, I know. So this was still 2012 or 2012, 2013. So the sequels, I think, were very, 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 very quietly in development, very, very early days, because the official transition from Lucasfilm to Disney occurred in 2014, but obviously there had been talks for years before that. At this point, and what I think I quite like about a lot of the legend stuff after the prequels and obviously before the canon gets reset, is that the only people reading Star Wars or consuming Star Wars content really at the time are fans who really want to get into it, who are willing to invest time.
Right.
They're willing to invest time for a long-term payoff. And so I think with a lot of these older stories, you get time, you get a bit of breathing space. Although I've mentioned these are very, very dense, and they are, the payoffs themselves take longer. And that it's not quite as, I think one of the issues with a lot of the modern Star Wars, as much as I am a fan of the vast majority of modern Star Wars,
Right.
is because since The Force Awakens came out, everyone and their mums suddenly love Star Wars again, which is fine. I'm up for everyone liking Star Wars, no matter what kind of fan you are. If you just watch movies or if you do like I do and obsessively try and consume everything all at once, you're still a fan of Star Wars. But I think that because of Star Wars now being on everyone's mind and everyone's lips, and everyone, even people who don't like Star Wars, are always talking about Star Wars now. I go into work and people are always talking about Star Wars. Before the canon reset, no one spoke about Star Wars unless you were already a Star Wars fan. It wasn't in the public consciousness anymore. The prequels came out and they disappeared.
Right.
Apart from the Clone Wars a bit, no one really spoke about it. So I think happened is that the modern Star Wars comics, unfortunately, because they're now catering to a much wider audience, a lot more people, old and young, are reading comics now because of the MCU and things like that as well has helped. Comics are no longer this sort of underground, secretive thing. They're coming much more into the forefront again, which has a lot of benefits to it, but also has a lot of drawbacks, which is they're now trying to aim at a much wider audience. And I think that's one of the problems with a lot of modern Star Wars, and one of the reasons why certain things such as Andor or The Bad Batch work so well, because they go, here's a story we're going to tell. Loosely, here's the audience. Done. We're going to go with that. And that's the story. With a lot of the other stuff, like a lot of the sequels and a lot of, I think my biggest issues with a lot of the live action series is they go, let's cast a really big net. We want the diehard Star Wars fans who have been with us since the original trilogy and the prequel fans, but also kids who are, going to getting into it, but also people who aren't that invested in Star Wars, who are just happy to watch it. As like, you can't keep them all happy. And if you try to keep them all happy, you just fail.
Yeah.
With this, the kind of people who are reading Dawn of the Jedi when it came out at the time were people willing to invest the time. And I think that that's very reflective that issues such as this, and books like the Darth Bane trilogy, which I still stand by as some of the best Star Wars writing in existence.
Absolutely.
It's just when you get these things, because they're not trying to worry about profit margins and deadlines, it's just all we need to do is release this thing. And as long as it makes enough money to keep going, it's fine. The mindset behind the publishing is very important to the product, because I think that there are more risks that can be taken. And this is a big risk, this Dawn of the Jedi stuff. And as we've kind of alluded to, and what you've kind of said, is that this is not one for a new Star Wars fan. You don't watch the 9 movies and the 2 additional ones in the anthology and delve into this. I think it would be too much.
Yeah.
This has to
Absolutely.
be someone who's really either read a lot of other sci-fi stuff already, or has already consumed quite a lot of Star Wars and expanded Star Wars content in comics, in books, in stuff. Yeah. Once you've got the understanding of the kind of language, the tools in which to process things like this, then you can delve into it. And that's what I appreciate. This comic does not treat you like an infant. It assumes you are a mature individual who can figure things out yourself. And I think that that's perfectly shown when Zesh is like looking, and again, it's furthering that, him thinking what they're going to do, and him just there watching them the whole time.
I will find you.
It's quite a brave thing to do when one of your main characters has been shown to be a terrible person, and they don't have a, unfortunately, quite cheap redemption. The redemption doesn't even necessarily come, which is one of the beauties of this.
Yeah.
It's about his perception of the Force and the world changing, not about him being good or him being evil and turning into someone good. There's much more subtext to that. I know that's a very long answer, but
no, it's amazing. It is a long answer, but it's, listening to it, it just adds layers to things that I didn't quite think about in those terms. For me, it just, again, it's something about short form storytelling that always pulled me in once I started reading, like as a teenager and as a kid. And what here, when I was introduced to comic book art, I was vaguely aware of it, back in Russia, but I really got into it here. You could clearly see what comic book is going for: sex appeal exploitation, right? A lot of Wildstorm comic books here, and a Danger Girl, and all of these, like, boobs galore and everything, which is fine for a teenager boy to look, oh my God, beautiful women. But as you grow, as you covet for something more than just like surface level entertainment, that's what this book was able to do, to give me. When you show me a scene in which the villain is not telling you how much of a badass he is, and again, I'm sorry, I know the modern comic books mean the world to you, and I don't mean to be bitter or resentful of it, but when Darth Vader did this, and all I see is Death Man surrounding me, that scene that everybody went berserk over, I felt that, to me, it was an exploitation of Darth Vader. It was accentuating everything that we already know what he is: powerful. Okay. All right, what else are you telling me that I didn't know about Vader? I'm looking at a villain who is not any more impressive than Darth Maul and Vader, not even nearly, right? Talking about Zesh. But I want to know something about him. You pulled me in, and you're pulling at my strings, dear, and I'm fully invested. That's what I appreciate. That's what I like.
I think a comparison I would make for Zesh to compare to the Clone Wars is actually Asajj Ventress, who I think starts off, because I'm currently doing a rewatch of the Clone Wars. Any of you listeners, plug for my own show, Genuine Chit Chat, go check out the YouTube channel. We're doing Clone Wars conversations every month, and so I'm going through it with 2 other people, someone who's watched it all once before, someone who's never seen it before. And we just finished season 3, which has the Night Sister arc in it, which is, in my opinion, one of the strongest arcs in the Clone Wars. Phenomenal stuff. I love the Night Sister and Dark Side Magic and all that stuff. But the first 2.5 series of Clone Wars, you're watching Asajj Ventress, and even in the Clone Wars micro series, the sort of 2D Legendy one, Ventress is cool, but that's all she is. You don't care. And the guy, our friend Math, who's never seen it before, we're not revealing stuff to him what's happened, and he has no concept of what happens in Clone Wars in the future. He's like, I don't get Ventress. Why does anyone care about her? And I'm like, I can't say too much, but it takes time.
Yeah.
Because she is very complex. She didn't choose to be a Jedi or a Sith assassin. She's been controlled by a force more powerful than her and dragged all across, from the Night Sisters into slavery, to the Jedi, to the Sith, then into bounty hunting. once she gets her own agency, and once you realize after the Dooku betrayal in season 3, once you get that and you get to really see what makes her tick, why she's doing what she's doing, her character goes from a kind of cool mustache twirling villain to a really in-depth human-like character that you can genuinely connect with, because if you were in that situation, how would you interact with it? And it's the same with Zesh, and that's one of the weaknesses of Anakin in the prequels, because he's the chosen one, he's amazing at everything immediately, and his entire journey is kind of mapped out for him. And you know, no one lives their life like that. But Zesh is in a situation where, and so is Asajj Ventress, they cannot control the environment they've been put into. They're in a negative space that is not their fault in any way. And them having negative responses to things makes sense because of what they've been through.
Yeah.
And that's what I think about Zesh is such an interesting character. That's why he is the driving force of these. When you read the first 2 issues, you're like, oh, he's the villain. I don't care.
Yeah.
By this issue, you're like, he's the reason I want to read more. He's the driving force now. He's the main character. Yeah. And the way that the issues have been written to do that is so clever. And, you know, I love canon comics. You know, I've read pretty much all of them. But
and they constantly, sorry to cut you off, and they constantly do that too. They put different characters in the forefront very deliberately.
Exactly. And I will agree. I will concede. The canon comics, I've read them all. I enjoy them all. But when people ask me what to read of canon comics, I would say half of them you can completely go over. You completely skip them because either they don't add anything, or well, it's normally just they don't add anything to anything. It's just, I love that Vader comic you referenced, the Vader Down crossover. It's amazing. But that's because I'm reading it going, I want a badass story. I want more Vader being badass. This is before Rogue One came out. This is before we've got all this animation and all of these amazing Vader things, and in the Kenobi show. And there was no Vader action apart from the limited stuff in the films and the comics. So I loved Vader Down for that reason, because I was like, oh my God, we get to see Vader being the badass everyone's told us he is. But now, because there's so much Vader content, all of it him being badass, it's saturated. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of the current canon comics.
Yeah. Moving on in the plot. Guan Jiang and the Jedi Masters arrive on the scene. They see the Force Hound fights bravely. He slays the giant abyss beast, and which releases a lightning storm. And the Jedi compel him to surrender. As the Master Quan Jing centers his awesome concentration to try to quell this storm, and he feels that Tython is out of balance, once again plagued by this vision. And he's struck by a lightning as Shaikota picks up the saber. And she fights her anger as she defeats Zesh, and Zesh is ready to die. He's there prostrate on the ground, and she's able to actually ignite the lightsaber for the first time. And he's beaten, but obviously the Jedi that they decide to not to go through with it, and she doesn't strike him down. Now, if you were to close your eyes and just give me a bit of a range of emotions, and as you're going through this, because you have your youngsters fighting here on this one side and the storm hitting from the other, and in the eye of the storm, as a Jedi Master, showing his awesome power, trying to put it all together.
So, sorry, what was the question?
The question is, can you, if you were to close your eyes, would you list a set of emotions, because they're barraging you with a lot of story and a lot of action going all simultaneously at the same time? What were you experiencing during that scene? I
mean, my heart was pumping because it was very, very intense, I'd say. And this was one of the parts I did have to kind of reread a little bit, because when the Master, whenever I look at him, I just think of Morpheus from The Matrix. When I saw him, I was kind of trying to work out, I know it says it, but what was happening, because there was so much going on all at once.
Right.
It was quite a lot to deal with, because I was really only interested in what was happening with Zesh at this point. But the emotions I was feeling was that I felt that Shay's interaction with Zesh really makes her as a character again elevated for me. This is like the moment where, Shay's really interesting now. Because where Shay is, again, she's conflicted, much like Zesh is. But unlike Zesh, she doesn't come from a place of overt darkness. She comes from a place of more so the light, but trying to be balanced, but is still human. And I think that the emotions that I felt with this, it's all this big, crescendo of all this. It's the big kind of conclusion to this arc, and everything's exploding and all this kind of crazy stuff going on and things. I was thrilled and I was intrigued, and I thought she could have easily, because I knew the next collection of stories was called The Prisoner of Bogan, and I thought she could kill Zesh, and she could be the Prisoner of Bogan. That could have been an eventuality. And it could have been how the stranger comes into this world. Mm-hmm. He causes this force storm because he and his actions put Shay down a dark path. That could have been an element because she's activating the blade. So I was just thrilled, to be honest with you, like of what was going on, because it was unpredictable and it felt like a big crescendo of stuff. But the problem is, I know it's the point, but there was a lot of characters, especially the blonde-haired woman, who she didn't necessarily feel like she was doing anything. This point, it kind of felt like, here's three characters that are the front and center, and everyone else was kind of secondary to that. So I enjoyed it, but for me, it's all about Zesh and Shay. That's, for me, what really speaks to me in this scene. What about yourself?
Well, I remember that panel where he sees the master, sees a vision as he's concentrating his force powers, and you see all of these Jedi, some of which we have not seen yet, show here. And the greatest emotion that I felt from it, it was like a movie sequence where somebody kicks you so hard, you sort of zoom out of a scene and you push back, and you kind of see it from a bird's eye view of this whole drama unfold, and you realize, oh snap, force is at play here. It's a permutation of good of evil. It's not the good battling the evil the way that we're used to observing from ground level. That's the way you watch all the Star Wars movies. But the comic book is able to give you that beautiful art where you see so many elements on one screen, on one page, and you're saying, oh my gosh, you start connecting the dots and you're saying, this is the force at play.
And I do like that scene. I do like seeing it. It made me think a little bit of Dragon Ball Z with like the spirit bomb, where it's like, everyone give me your power kind of stuff. I thought it was cool. I did really like that scene because I like, again, as you say, being able to see the different Jedi. And again, from Into the Void, some of them you kind of have a bit more knowledge of from the book. Being able to connect these dots. And one thing that I quite liked about it, again, I really only picked this up on the second read through of this issue, was that, because on my second read through, I was basically like, let's try and pay attention to stuff that isn't just about Zesh, because I need to pay attention to the other.
You're a fanboy.
Yeah, I am, clearly. But I think that I liked about it was that this shows the Jedi, or at least Force users, having a connection to the Force that we don't get to see in the movies. The connection that I think was intentional, that these beings are so in tune with Tython and the Force itself. I know that Tython was a Force-rich planet, but still, they have the power to change the weather. They can all connect, and I know in Legends, battle meditation and things like that was quite a common ability, but they can all connect together and utilize the Force to actually shape an environment of a planet, really actually change the balance of the Force in a physical way. Whereas I feel like if the prequel era Jedi were there, they wouldn't know what to do with themselves. Yoda would have some loose plan, but I feel like they would be there trying to almost absorb the storm in a way, instead of kind of like, it feels like he was trying to let it go through him and he was trying to channel it. And that's, I think, the way he processes the Force. Whereas I feel like the prequel era Jedi were actually a lot more like the Sith in a way of trying to force the Force into their narrow-minded sort of projection of it. They have a perception of the Force is like this, so the Force has to go through this for them to conceptualize it. Whereas these are more like, the Force is going to do what the Force is going to do, but we can try and channel it. We can try and guide it. It's almost like it's like a beast. It's like, it makes me think of that parable where the lion gets the thorn in its paw and it's attacking everyone. Mm-hmm. And all it takes is a calm person to go up there, look at it, pull the thorn out, and the lion stops attacking.
I love how you put it, man.
That's how I feel about the Force is represented in this, the end of this book.
And once again, speaking to a different age of how can you demonstrate the awesomeness of the Jedi of the yore, the age gone by, without necessarily resorting to their physical prowess. Guys, I'm gonna wrap this up with the finale of this issue, and we're gonna have like just a couple of more general questions, then we'll wrap this up. So days later, after the battle, the Jedi Masters and their pupils recover. Now the Force Hound awakens in an infirmary. He's quite surprised to be alive, to be amongst people who don't wish him ill, and young Seknos jokes around with Master Kwai Jangs. There's elevated mood all around. And Shai is the first to ignite the strange weapon, and they make all a mental note of it. Aha, okay, some progress there. Now the Twi'lek Princess Tasha feels strong bond with Zesh, and she feels that they all were chosen. They came together through this providence of the Force. And the woman helps him unlock his memory. She says, let me in. Let's sort this problem out together. And we see this vision of a vast battle fleet, this Rakata armada, followed by the Starforge. So the Knights of the Republic games, you guys will know it. Hold on that panel if it's in your thoughts before your eyes, because I do have a question in regards to that. And it's very much, if you can compare it to something like the Mass Effect 2 ending, where we know, like, okay, the army is coming. It's a very, very foreboding kind of like scene. And the decision is made to send the captive Force Hound Zesh to the Bogan to spend his time, and not necessarily, they don't straight out call him a prisoner, but to meditate on his deeds and contemplate the Ashla and Bogan and kind of recenter himself, and maybe something will good come out of it. And at the end of it, they say a very interesting phrase where the path of the Jedi is different from the path of the Shadow Warrior, which Zesh believes himself to be. And we cut away back to the moon, where our stranger Dagon, he ominously looks at the sky and it has begun. I couldn't help but think of the Mortal Kombat and our favorite, Fansum, it has begun, that kind of scene. So first and foremost, you did mention that you didn't have a lot of prior knowledge to the Rakata lore. But what did that scene, first of all, did you recognize what you're looking at when you saw the Starforge? And how did it make you feel that, like, oh my God, this battle fleet is coming?
I did not recognize the Starforge. I loosely know what it is, but to be honest, and this isn't a slight on your question, this is me, I am sick to death of super weapons in Star Wars. I hate them. I think they suck. I hate them in all media because they're so overtly powerful.
Yeah,
they get one hit on something and then they explode without fail, because you can't have a weapon capable of destroying planets keep on going, because it can't. Because if it does, it will destroy the galaxy, and that's the end of the story. So whenever they come up, I'm like, oh, boring. It's just like no interest, zero for me. I hate super weapons, and I'm saying I really hope with the canon. They did Death Star 1, Death Star 2 in the original trilogy. They brought the bloody Starkiller base in
Death Star 3, we can safely call it.
And I was like, yep. And I was like, okay, fine. Force Awakens is like a soft reboot of the original trilogy, whatever. Okay, I can look past that. And then in Rise of Skywalker, they're like, every ship has got a Death Star cannon. And you're like, are you kidding me? And then you're like, oh, Palpatine could shoot a beam up and destroy everything. And you're like, this is so dull. There's no, when you have it's like in Dragon Ball Z, oddly enough, when you have a villain that's so unfathomably powerful that you have no hope of defeating them, you're going to defeat them, because you can't let them live, because they'll destroy everything. So that was a little rant of just how much I hate super weapons and beings of unfathomable, ridiculous power, unless like the Mortis arc in Clone Wars. What did I think of the fleet coming through? I thought it was interesting, but the part of this that I like the most is the character development, and I wasn't looking forward to the war really, and I know it kind of gets into that later. But what I really liked is the image of Zesh attached in those pod things and powering and explaining, like, the dark side is basically powering the ships. I think it alluded to it earlier on, but seeing it there, of just laying there and being basically like harnessed energy from you. It made me think again of the Matrix and the human batteries and stuff. I thought it was really powerful, and it showed how evil the Rakata are and why they're so scary. Far better than just watching them enslave Tatooine and kill a couple of like peasants like that. Not to be rude, but if you have a gun, you can kill any poor person. Do you know what I mean? Whereas this is like a next level. This isn't just you've got power. This is the technology in which you're using is clearly problematic. Just before you even see what it does, you can see the way it's powered is really messed up. So that idea really intrigued me. I very much enjoyed that element of it.
Yeah. Well, obviously, for me, guys, you probably have guessed as a huge fan of the Knights of the Old Republic games, which I first played when they came out. This was a huge reward, and something that you said, it's a comic series written by fans for fans who have stayed with this franchise for decades. And you see a full circle come around, and it never felt like, oh, by the way, remember, Rakata back in the day in this particular video game? We're just going to have them show up here a little bit. When they come in, it's almost like Tarkin in Rogue One. I loved the way they brought him back. He wasn't just this cheap cameo, like, Tarkin, get in there. It's that era. We need a little bit of you in there. He was quite an integral part of the plot, showing the intricate, inner politics of the Imperial rank. But here, it's that reward of a lifelong fan reading it and saying, aha, that's where it all started. It's like a grandfather, and you're this child, and he's by your bedside, and he's reading you this awesome storybook. So this is how this happened. Again, they're calling back to archaism and back in the day, and the early Jedi. All of that stuff is almost like a mythological feel to it. And when I saw that panel, it was quite awesome. But there was another. Go ahead.
I was just going to quickly say, it's funny you say it because I know how much I'm a prequel defender and you're not a fan. In Attack of the Clones, I felt that way when you see the Death Star, when the Geonosian Poggle the Lesser. It's quite a subtle scene. A lot of people miss it, which is Poggle the Lesser is just.
No, I loved it.
And that's the kind of thing I think works with this, which is show, don't tell. You don't need to go, oh, is this the Death Star? Yes, it is. I hope we can build it one day. It was just, on screen, gone.
Yep.
Plans for something scary. Don't mention it.
And I sure as hell noticed it in theaters. And as I told you in our discussions, when I came out of Revenge of the Sith, that's the movie I took home with me, knowing that I will probably never see any other Star Wars movie ever again. Because George said it's over. And I told myself, like, Ben, okay, you have problem here, problem there. Did you enjoy yourself? I'm like, yeah. Did you notice that little Death Star here? I'm like, yeah, that's my childhood. Honestly, I came away with, I can't say it was like exhilarating, overwhelming experience, but I can say like, man, that sure felt like a straight punchline to it. It felt like I really did see a Star Wars movie. But there's another question that I wanted to ask you, and it's the Twilight Princess, Tasha. For some reason, she's compelled to go see Zesh. I personally saw a bit of a romantic connection there, but what she was driving at least through dialogue, she says that we are all connected. We are in this together. Of course, obviously, I'm paraphrasing, but what do you think compelled her to do that? And how is that connection to another Force sensitive different? How are these early Jedi different from the prequel era Jedi?
Well, on your second question, it's more because where they are free to experience the light and the dark side of the Force, when you get someone who's more in the light or the dark, they're more willing to have a dialogue and explain rather than being like, abomination, don't touch, abstain. Mm-hmm. So that's the second part. With the first part, I didn't get the romantic part of it, but I didn't really get why she wanted to be honest. I feel like Shay doing it would have made a lot more sense. I know she mentions that she does mention Shay. I feel like for me, it was almost just to give her something to do. Because again, I think she's a weak link here. And even if, oddly enough, Sesh in the prior issue does say, oh yeah, Tasha's the weak link. They're throwing her to the giant worm thing to let her die so they can escape. But I think it's because what's revealed in a later issue, and it's kind of cheating, is that she's so empathetic and she's such a good-hearted person that she really actually does just want to help. And I think that's, again, part of something that really shines through is that their dialogue when he says, I'm a prisoner, you can do with me what you want. And she's like, yeah, but I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
If you want me to do this, I'll do it. If you don't, I'll just go. And I think that she is one of the final nails in the coffin for Zesh of really considering the light side of the Force and who he is, which I really did appreciate. So I liked it.
Yeah, on my side, I just want to say it was an interesting note. For some reason, I thought maybe I wanted to see that a little romance there. But the difference, the distinction I made, like a mental note, was that the prequel era Jedi are a lot more pragmatic and reason driven. You can't do this, you cannot do that. Where these early Jedi are a little bit unrefined and they're governed by faith and feeling and intuition. Mike, before I ask my final question, thanks so much for joining me. This has been an epic discussion. I'm not even used to podcasting for this long. There's so much fun stuff going on there. But honestly, thank you guys. Obviously, all the relevant links will be dropped in the video description below. Go check out Mike's content. We're going to be covering, hopefully, a lot more modern and retro comic books. But the last question is, The Dawn of the Jedi, Part 1, is a very dense world, right? There's a lot of moving pieces there. You know, we see tales of the ancient past. We see the Jedi journeyman. We see their masters. We see the infinite empire that, you know, is basically on collision course to, you know, to conquer this part of the galaxy. If you were to pick one aspect of these first 5 books that you read that stuck out the most to you, what was it?
I'd say the complexity of the characters, really. The fact that none of them are clear cut, goody or baddie, you know, apart from the Rakata lot of sort of Praetor generals, but they're really not. They're not in this very much. They're not even really main characters at all.
Yeah.
So I think it's just the moral ambiguity that it portrays that shows that you can do things out of anger without being a hateful person. You can do bad things without being a bad person. And that all it takes is one event or one person that can completely change your outlook on the world. And I think that that is a lesson that translates through, I mean, beyond sci-fi and fantasy. And I know that a lot of sci-fi and fantasy is really just being a commentary on our own lives, but framed in a different way. But that's the thing I think for me that I enjoyed the most at these 5, which is the characters themselves were introduced in a very good way. And I feel like at the end of this, I understand the characters really well, even a lot of the ones that didn't necessarily have that much dialogue. I think it really clearly sets them apart.
Yeah, that's really, really awesome observation. I felt the same way. But for me, the comic book that set the precedent for me personally when I read it was The Tales of the Jedi. The way in which it deconstructed and devolved the Star Wars that we knew into its ancient past is unparalleled in Star Wars today. There's no book that rivals that. But when this came out, I think they accomplished it in a very, very delicate manner to look at all the material that came before, to look at what Tom Veitch and Kevin J. Anderson were doing in the Tales of the Jedi and say, okay, we're going even more back in the past. But we're not creating this story in a vacuum. We're going to respect what came before us. How can we look at what these guys have done? Because I find visually the Tales of the Jedi just astounding. From ship design to character models to the Sith, I'm in awe every time I flip those pages. But when we get to this, I believe it. They sell it. They sell it with art. We've talked about the character models, the way they respond, the way they act, the way they talk. They're like these living and breathing characters that you went on a journey with for a while, and you got to learn a little bit about their world. And this a more innocent, a more unrefined, a little bit a frontiersman world where these Jedi are just beginning to learn what the Force is all about.
Very good point. Yeah, I've not read the Tales of the Jedi. I know you've recommended it numerous times to me, but maybe in this series at some point.
We need the podcast.
Yeah, there you go. Stay tuned. Subscribe, guys, and then you won't miss it when we talk about it.
Absolutely, guys, because Mike does some amazing comic book discussions on his channel. Once again, all the links will be provided for you guys, and I can't wait to begin talking modern comic books with you, and I hope that you really get to sway my mind and make me look at it from a whole different angle.
Maybe.
Well, guys, thanks a lot.
I've got a few good ones, but there's a few that are more of a gamble. So we'll see. There'll be a couple mini series, a couple of ongoings. We'll see where we go.
Please start with the bangers, okay?
I will try. I will try my absolute best for people. But yeah, they can find me at Genuine Chit Chat as well. Right. And I've done lots of Star Wars interviews. I know Ben's done quite a few as well, but I've done quite a few of a lot of High Republic authors and stuff like that. Yeah. So. Check out
Mike, yours is one of the channels which you really go to and you see the heart and soul of a Star Wars fan who can embrace it all and at the same time critique when the critique is due. Guys, thank you so much for checking us out. This will continue. Next time we're going to cover the second 5 issues of the Dawn of the Jedi. We'll check you next guy. It's been
just cut
5 issues long.
That should be the end. That should be the end.
We will check you guys later. Benjamin is exhausted. It has been a lot of fun. Please consider subscribing to both of our channels. We'll see you guys next time.